Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome back to day 2 of the 59th Leangkollen Security Conference. Either you are here with us in the historic University Aula or following us online. I hope you had a great conference day yesterday and found the discussions on NATO 75, past, present and future transatlantic security in an era of strategic competition and a year of US elections, both informative and fruitful. And for the newcomers, just let me remind you that the backdrop of this conference is the effect of Russia's full-scale war on Ukraine, on the transatlantic partnership, NATO as an alliance, the US and European security system. Russia's war in Ukraine has brought about deep changes in the alliance. NATO are facing a new era of collective defense. Russia's war has also brought Finland and Sweden into the alliance, soon Sweden. With the Nordic enlargement of NATO, we are seeing a reshaping of Northern European security and defense, which constitutes NATO's Northern Flank. How will the changed security dynamics of the Nordic region affect NATO? And how should Norway adapt to a new security environment? These are the main topics of today, which will end with a debate among 7 parliamentarians who will discuss their party's understanding on how Norway should respond to the new security situation and what are their party's input to the coming long-term defense plan Prime Minister Støre talked about yesterday. This debate will be in Norwegian and will be led by political editor in the daily newspaper Dagens Næringsliv, Fridtjof Jacobsen. Just let me remind you that you will find more extensive bios in our conference program. Thus, let me welcome our keynote speaker today. Just a couple of weeks ago, he gave a strong warning which was followed up by a string of Western leaders that European citizens need to be ready for a possibly military conflict with Russia in a decade or 2. We have to realize it's not a given that we are in peace, he said. Please, Admiral Rob Bauer, the floor is yours. I will just tell that he's the 33rd chair of NATO's military committee, and prior to that, he was the chief of the Netherlands Army. Please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be back in Oslo, and I want to thank the Norwegian Atlantic Committee for the invitation and the hospitality. 5 months ago, the Allied and invitee chiefs of defense gathered here, not in this aula, but in Oslo, to discuss the strengthening of NATO's deterrence and defense. Since then, the global security environment has become even more challenging. We face the most dangerous world in decades, with a record amount of violence and conflict. The rules-based international order is under unimaginable threat. And even though this year's billions of people will cast their ballots in a democratic election, the concept of democracy needs to be defended more than ever. A few weeks from now, we can hopefully finally welcome Sweden officially into our NATO family. We all hope this happens sooner rather than later, because time is not on our side. 1 month ago, Swedish Chief of Defense General Mikael Bydén stated that his country needs to mentally prepare for war, and that Russia is and will be a threat. A week later, when all the Allied Chiefs of Defense gathered around the table in NATO headquarters, we expressed our full support for his statement, and we reiterated it from a NATO level. This is not about scaring people. This is about preparing people. However the war in Ukraine develops, NATO will still have a Russia problem. On a military level, the realization that we have entered into a new era of collective defense started already after the annexation of Crimea. On the political level, this realization sank in after February 2022. And now we need this realization to sink in on a societal level as well. Because whether we like it or not, war is a whole of society event, as the people in Ukraine found out. Therefore, the prevention of war should also be a whole of society event. In many allied nations on the eastern flank, the Russian threat is felt very clearly. But in countries with a different geographical position, that has not happened yet. That is why so many military and political voices are speaking out now about the need to prepare. Because if we prepare, we ramp up our resilience, we ramp up our deterrence, and we minimize the chance of an adversary ever attempting to start a conflict. It is not a given that we are at peace. We need only to look at Ukraine, where the unthinkable did happen. And as a defensive alliance, it is our sacred task to expect the unexpected. Ladies and gentlemen, despite rising conflict and growing security threats, I want to stipulate that there is cause for optimism as well. I would say realistic optimism. On the one hand, it is important that we see the world for what it is and not what we would like it to be, as was the case in the last 25 years. Let's be honest. The assumption that if you have an economical relationship with a country, you will never have a military conflict with that country has been proven wrong. And the assumption that democracy was such an attractive concept that it didn't need marketing has also been proven wrong. But that does not mean we should allow ourselves to slip into lethargic pessimism. There is, as I said, cause for optimism. Why? Because we have NATO. NATO has gone through unprecedented change at an unprecedented pace. A prime example is the Finnish and soon the Swedish accession. This will cement and deepen the strong cooperation between Nordic and Baltic allies already in place. It will bolster regional security on the northern flank of our alliance, across borders and the Baltic Sea. Norway, Finland, Denmark and Sweden have agreed to increase their defense budgets, in part to purchase more capabilities and equipment, including jets and ships to better patrol their skies and seas and detect non-allied submarines, including in the Arctic. Our Nordic allies are also looking to work more closely together by integrating some of their defense policies. And Norway, Sweden, Finland and Denmark have agreed to operate their approximately 250 fighter jets as a joint operational fleet and also support air policing over Iceland. Together, we have made immense strides in our collective defense, and we will continue on that path. The defense plans agreed at the Vilnius summit and discussed by our chiefs of defense in Brussels last month are the most comprehensive defense plans NATO has had since the end of the Cold War. Never before have NATO and national defense plans been so closely interlinked, which will shape our armed forces for decades to come. Allies are now actively working to maximize their ability to execute these new plans, and that includes required forces and capabilities, command and control arrangements, military mobility and required stocks, necessary authorities, and crucially, more collective defense exercises and training. Our aim is, should it come to it, to execute these plans with a minimum amount of risk. We want to make sure that we ramp up our military capabilities in order to deter and defend any potential threat now and in the future. As we speak, exercise Steadfast Defender 2024 is underway, the largest NATO exercise in decades, with approximately 90,000 forces from all 31 allies and Sweden. This is a record number of soldiers. Steadfast Defender 24 will test and refine our new defense plans. This exercise will demonstrate our ability to deploy forces rapidly from North America and other parts of the alliance to reinforce the defense of Europe. It will show that we can conduct and sustain complex multi-domain operations over several months across thousands of kilometers from the high north to Central and Eastern Europe and in any condition. We are training together to keep our people safe, defend our territory, and safeguard our shared values. Steadfast Defender will be a testament to our readiness and strength, demonstrating the transatlantic bond and spirit in action. Sending a clear message to any adversary that NATO can and will protect Allied territory. Exercise Nordic Response in the Northern Nordic early next month is one of the exercises associated with Steadfast Defender 2024. As pointed out by the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Cavoli, Nordic Response is an important milestone in further integration of a common Nordic into NATO and for our new plans. Over 20,000 troops from at least 14 countries are training to defend northern Norway, Sweden and Finland on land, in the air and at sea. Steadfast 24 is only one of many steps NATO is taking to fulfill the core task of collective defense and deterrence. It is of crucial importance that we keep a 360-degree view on security, and that while we have a sharp focus on the eastern flank, we have an equally sharp focus on the northern flank. That is why NATO has doubled the number of ships patrolling in the North and the Baltic Sea and stepped up intelligence sharing. Increased surveillance and also the protection of critical undersea infrastructure is vital for allies in the region and our soon-to-be ally, Sweden. At the same time, we need to keep an eye on the increased competition and militarization in the Arctic region. For many years, the Arctic has benefited from cross-border cooperation and peaceful dialogue, but unfortunately the old saying, high north, low tension, no longer applies. As a defensive alliance, we have to prepare for the fact that the Russian threat can also come from the high north. And we have to take into account that China's intentions for this region are not transparent and have to be seen also in the light of a broader and deepening strategic relationship between China and Russia. The alliance has a clear interest in seeing stability, security, and peaceful cooperation in the region. We have a responsibility to protect all our allies, including the 6, soon to be 7, situated in the Arctic. Ladies and gentlemen, as I stated in the beginning, NATO has undergone a transformational decade. For a long time, especially Europe and Canada, underestimated the importance of Article 3. Every ally must be able to defend itself. And now that realization is back, bringing NATO home to its own geography. Article 5 can only be effective if Article 3 is firmly in place. And Article 3 can only work if public and private actors work together. If we have a whole of society approach. NATO is what we want it to be. NATO is what we make of it. And collective defense is truly a task for the collective. For 75 years, NATO has demonstrated an unparalleled ability to unite, protect, and adapt. The preamble to the Washington Treaty is as true now as it was 75 years ago. NATO is prepared and confident to take on new challenges, always determined to strengthen collective defense and preserve peace and security. We are the most successful alliance in history, not because of any aggressive display of military strength or territory we have brutally conquered. We are the most successful alliance in history because of the peace we have brought, the countries we have united, and the conflicts we have prevented from spiraling out of control. In the words of the French Chief of Defense, because of our ability to win the war before the war. That is what has attracted so many nations to freely and actively apply for membership. In 1949, Norway was among the 12 founding members. In 2024, we will welcome Sweden as our 32nd member. Every day, our nations choose the we above the me. We are all sovereign nations with different historical and cultural backgrounds, but we turn our diversity into strength, and each debate makes the ultimate solution stronger. NATO is a consensus organization. That means that we move forward together or we don't move at all. And the reason for that is because in the end, there are people in Portugal willing to die for people in Poland, people in Canada willing to die for people in Czechia, people in the Netherlands willing to die for people in Norway, including myself, but hopefully not during this conference. Ladies and gentlemen, at a time when authoritarian regimes are desperately trying to portray an image of strength to the world, at a time where global security threats are multiplying and our values are under attack, we need a shield against aggression more than ever. And I'm immensely proud to be working with all of you on how to make that shield even stronger. And I'm confident that together we have what it takes to protect what we all hold dear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Admiral. I know you have, you will answer some questions from the audience, but let me start. Your warning a couple of weeks ago that we couldn't, rule out war in our time, even with Russia. Why does it come now? Why was it so important? And why did you address the citizens of Europe?
The interesting thing is that I actually talk about this for the last 1.5 years in public addresses as well. The interesting thing was that it was suddenly picked up in the massive way that it was. I mean, that was in a way a bit of a surprise for me as well. I think because a number of other players talked about these things, or part of the things I was talking about. So President Macron said a number of things. Minister Pistorius said a number of things. The Swedish defense chief said some things. So for some reason or the other, it got enough critical mass and it sort of exploded. But it was not necessarily a new thing I was talking about. I passionately believe we need to have a better understanding in our societies of the relevance, importance of the armed forces. For too long, we thought, especially after the end of the Cold War, we thought we have a professional military and they solve our problems. For a long time, we had sort of a 911, and if a nation would call the NATO headquarters, the operator would look in the list, and let's say Portugal called and we have a problem, and then the operator would look in the list and would see which nation was in the NATO response force or in the VJTF, and then that nation would get a call, and then that nation would help Portugal. That is how we organized ourselves for 25 years. That was not collective defense. And so we have to go back to that. We have to go back to Article 3, the ability to defend yourself, because for a lot of nations it was basically, and people, I mean, ministers literally said to me, like, of course we cannot defend ourselves. We have NATO. And that is the wrong attitude. So I think that is now sinking in, but it is not something that should be solved by the military, by the ministers of defense. It is our problem. It is a society problem. All of you want more security. Therefore, all of us are part of the solution.
One more question for me before we take in the audience. You also visited Norway in September with the whole military committee from NATO. And you said in a in a discussion that it's difficult to prepare for a battlefield where nobody is invisible, because this is somehow the lessons learned from Ukraine. You can't hide in the modern warfare with drones, swarms of drones. How can we prepare for this? How can we cope with that?
Yeah, I think hiding becomes more and more difficult, and that means a lot, because it means that forces will need to be on the move constantly. If you look at, let's say, divisional headquarters, corps headquarters, they are on the move every 2 to 4 days in Ukraine. They change position with the whole headquarters. Even the strategic headquarters in Kiev moves its position every couple of days. So you basically have to assume that the enemy knows where you are. And then it is about being constantly on the move and making sure that the time between detection and the moment when an artillery round or a missile is hitting the position where you hopefully are no longer, that is shortening. So that is a big challenge. But it also means that this sort of idea that we had beautiful headquarters, which were buildings with flagpoles, and a lot of hundreds of millions were invested in them, is basically no longer practical.
You have to be on the move most of the time. Stephen Erlanger, you would like to ask a question?
Thank you, Admiral. Steve Erlanger, New York Times. A fairly simple question. Russia's used only a very small part of its capabilities in Ukraine. There's lots of other capabilities. If you were to identify some of NATO's biggest vulnerabilities in the face of this, would you say it's societal? Is it technological? Is it shortage of air missile defense? What are the areas that sort of concern you the most? Thank you.
Should we collect a couple of questions?
Yeah, that's fine.
We have also Karsten Friis.
Good morning, Admiral. If I may, 2 questions. The first one, you talked about the plans, and now it has to be filled with capabilities, forces, and NATO had its new force model. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, because it's extremely ambitious. The new force model in NATO, how is it going, so to speak? And the second question, if I may, as a Navy officer, one lesson from Ukraine is see what they can do without a Navy in actually pushing Russia back in the Black Sea. What are the implications for NATO?
Okay.
Okay. We have to understand that, and that's what I also tell journalists in general when they interview me about all the things we need to do. And then they sort of say, but it's not going to happen, it's too difficult. And I'm not saying you say this, but so the tone is always negative. We have to understand we have underinvested as societies for more than 30 years in our armed forces. And so the result is what it is. We need to do a lot. And it is all the things you talked about. It is integrated air missile defense. It is stocks. It is ammunition, it is more troops, it is more exercises, it is more capabilities, basically across the board, especially, although I would say especially in the land domain. We need to do most of the work on the enablement of the land forces. So it's a huge undertaking, and so that is in itself a challenge. Then we need an industrial base that is actually capable of doing that faster than it is capable of doing now. So I started talking about this in March 2022, and everybody was sort of looked at me like, ministers looked at me and said, well, we're giving away stuff, so don't moan about the production. And I said, well, actually, you're not starting to give away from full warehouses. You're starting to give away from half-full warehouses. So therefore, as I once said, the bottom of the barrel will be visible fairly soon. And so nations are taking risk, which is good. Nations are taking risk to give away weapon systems, which they also need for our own defense. And the risk they take is understandable and in a way responsible because the Russians are busy in Ukraine, especially their land forces. And although the numbers have gone up in Ukraine, the quality has gone down. And so the Russian land forces will have to be reconstituted, not only in quantity but also in quality. And that will take a number of years. There's a difference of opinion amongst the allies on how long that will be. So the intelligence services will have to look at this and see how fast it will go. But the time sort of differences between 3 and 7, 8 years. The production uplift in the Russian production on artillery is going up much faster than everybody expected. So that is a serious problem for Ukraine and for us. So there's a number of concerns, and we have to address them all. And that's why I also say to our societies that they have to help. Because if we really start to produce more, we might come to the point where we have to prioritize, where we will say we're not going to produce some consumer goods because we need to produce things for defense. And then that will have an effect on our society. But in the Second World War, the Americans couldn't buy a Ford automobile because the Ford was producing military vehicles only. So it will have an effect on our societies if that happens. I'm in favor of it because I think it is necessary. But that's the sort of difficult discussion that the politicians have to take on. I'm sort of pushing from my position because I think it is necessary. We need to do the things faster than we are doing them now. We need the private sector more. I think one of the problems in our society is not only that in our liberal economies we changed our way of doing things to just in time, just enough. And we now know it's not enough and it's too late. And therefore we have to change that. It's not stupid to have stocks. In the private sector, it was stupid to have stocks because it's dead money. Actually, in healthcare and in the military, it's wise to have stocks. And so all these things are happening at the same time. And we have to convince the private sector they need to dig in. They have to participate in this. For a long time, the security and defense was not seen as adding value in the economic sense. I think that's wrong, because actually security and stability is the foundation on which economic activity can be conducted. Factories and private sector for 80 years didn't have to think about, is my factory there tomorrow morning? Other than maybe a hurricane or a fire, but not through military destruction. And that is a reality. And therefore, the private sector has to understand we add value to the economy if we have a good and strong defense. So it's a lot of things that need to be done. I won't single out any of them in particular, because we have to work on all of them. So that's one. Then on the two questions of you, sir. First, on the plans. I think it is very ambitious, but the good thing is, and that was the big change in 2018 when the Chiefs of Defense rewrote the military strategy. We did that based on two threats, Russia and the terrorist groups. And for a long time, we didn't have plans based on threats, which is remarkable. So we reintroduced that, and basically we sort of introduced policy, because those plans then became the foundation of all the work that is now being done, including the regional plans that were approved in Vilnius. And all these plans are in more and more detail, what do you need to do to deter and defend against these two threats? The regional plans look into the regional the geography of the north, the center or the south of Europe. And then out of that came the forces we need, the force structure requirements. And then the new force model is about the people that have to man these units. And yes, it is more soldiers at a higher readiness. So we talk about I mean, if you looked at the NRF, it was like 40,000 or something. We now talk about 300,000 in Tier 1 and Tier 2, and much more in Tier 3, which over time you need more forces. If a conflict takes longer, then you need more soldiers. So you have to have a system to facilitate that. Basically, all that work, the force structure requirements, the new force model, the command and control that is then connected to that, is all will lead to a huge overhaul, basically, of the military system. The biggest one, I would dare to say, since 1949. So it is very ambitious, but it is necessary, because if we want to be able to do what we basically, why we exist, collective defense, is we need to make that work again. Then on the Ukrainian naval actions without a navy. It is remarkable. They use drones and other means to, and missiles to, basically, they pushed the Russian Navy out of Sevastopol, and they're now hiding on the other side of Crimea. I wouldn't say that it will have the same implications for all our navies, because the work on the Atlantic Ocean is a different ballgame than the work on the Black Sea. So it will have implications, most likely, for example, in the Baltic. So because similar sizes, maybe the Mediterranean, where you're closer to the shore. But in the Atlantic Ocean, in the Pacific, in the larger oceans, I think the more classical way of maritime operations will continue to exist. But we have to adapt to this. We have to realize that it's asymmetrical what the Ukrainians have done, and very, very successful. Very, very successful.
Thank you very much, Admiral Bauer. We are very grateful and honored that you took the time to come to Oslo. You survived this opening address.
I survived yesterday evening, I think.
That was even
you should have been there.
It was a nice dinner, a nice opening address, and thank you very much for spending time together with us. Give him a big applause. So now we will have a panel led by my good friend Julian Lindley-French, who will moderate it. Unfortunately, Vice Admiral Rune Andersen has also got the flu. This is winter time in Norway, and but we have got a very good replacement. The panelists will be introduced by Julian. I give you the floor and hand over a great panel.
Thank you, Kate. Let me invite my panel to join me on the stage. That's Svein Effjestad. Svein, there you are, good man. Arne Bård Dalhar. Arne, good man, carry on. Per Erik Solli. Per Erik, come and join us. And Christine von Brusgaard, please. Great. We're going to keep this fairly informal. Thank you. You can all see the bios of my distinguished panelists in the literature. So I want to get down to business and I want to focus on the issue in the program. The title of the session is The Reshaping of Northern European Security and Defence. I'd go as far as saying, as Admiral Bauer said, this is the transformation. If you'd have said to me, even a few years ago on my visits to Helsinki and Stockholm, that Sweden and Finland would be members of our alliance, not only is it a major step forward in the defence of Europe, it's probably the greatest example of strategic incompetence on the part of the Russians in recent decades. And that's saying something. Their strategic incompetence, obviously invading Ukraine is probably the greatest one, but this is incompetent consequence of Moscow's actions. But it also shows something that wasn't discussed, even though I tried to discuss it over many years, the return of great power competition in this region. I mean, Norway's a frontline state now. You're a frontline energy state. You're a frontline state in terms of the Russian Northern Fleet, in terms of the Arctic and increasingly contested space. So the security dynamics themselves are being profoundly changed. So there are three questions that we will address in this session. First, how will these changing Nordic dynamics affect NATO? Two, how is NATO policy and planning responding? And what are the implications for Norwegian security and defence planning, given the profound changes that we have underway? I'll invite my panellists to give a 10-minute opening address in the order of Svein, Arne, Per Erik, and Kristen. Svein, you've been described as the Norwegian Andy Marshall. Now, those of us who had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Marshall in his net assessment, that's quite a compliment. What's your net assessment of the situation today, and given what you've heard from Admiral Bauer?
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. It may be a big surprise for you to see me on the podium. I can assure you it's even a bigger surprise for me. I was talked into this 10 minutes ago. Let me first say that we have an excellent basis for Nordic cooperation. We have consulted closely on defense and security for the last 35 years. It has not been so much known in public in the beginning, but now, after we established the NORDEFCO organization, it has become very well known as well. Already in 2018, ministers of defense agreed that we will cooperate closely in peace, crisis, and conflict by 2024. And that is actually what's happening. So for the last at least 6 years, we have been preparing to cooperate militarily in crisis and conflict. So the basis is excellent. We have very good interoperability amongst the Nordic states. We have done exercises together regularly for a long, long time, and also deployed together in the Balkans and in Afghanistan. We have also had regular political consultations at the ministerial level for a long, long time, so I think the basis is excellent. A good example is also what we call the cross-border training for the air forces, where we have actually delegated to the Air Force themselves to agree on how to train across borders. We have also established a system of easy access in which forces can transfer across borders very easily. So I think we have a very good basis for going into a more organized cooperation within the framework of NATO. Together we have something like 1,500 kilometers of land border to Russia. So it is very important that we establish a policy for how we deal with the military challenges with Russia. We already have agreed to have common exercises. The first example now will be Nordic response instead of the cold response. But we also need to know what do we do with Arctic Challenge, these huge air exercises that we arrange in the north. Earlier, we have agreed to warn or to tell the Russians in advance that now we will deploy about 100 combat aircraft to the north. And from the Norwegian side, we have been very clear there's nothing to lose by telling them in advance. They will know anyway. And one very good thing about the Nordic cooperation is that if you put a Nordic label in front of whatever it is, you're almost guaranteed to have full political support in all 5 Nordic countries. The Nordic label is so easy to sell in all Nordic countries, and we should use that also in defense. I think it is important also that the Nordic countries take an initiative. We shouldn't lean back and wait for NATO to decide what we will do in the north. We need to consult closely and come up with a joint Nordic proposal on how we will deal with different issues. And I think if the 5 Nordic countries agree on that, there's a very good chance that we will succeed, indeed. So we have heard about these gloomy prospects for world peace and security, and I think the only good news is what's happening in the north. We also have a common stance when it comes to transatlantic relations. We have, all the Nordic countries have close agreements with the Americans. We have the Supplementary Defense Cooperation Agreement. From Norway, we have, I think, soon to be 12 sites, which will be a common use. The Finnish, the Swedes, and the Danes have similar systems. The Icelanders have very close cooperation in Keflavik. So we have this already predetermined cooperation with the Brits and the Americans, with Germany, and I think we can build on that. I'm also very happy that the Joint Forces Command in Norfolk seems to take this responsibility, because there needs to be an arc of allied cooperation from North America across the Arctic, through the Scandinavian area, down to the Baltic region. And a former commander of Northcom in Colorado Springs said that the Arctic might well be a forward air defense zone for the United States. So the United States also have very strong national interest in maintaining this arc of cooperation. We have a lot of deficiencies in the Norwegian defense, even though we took an initiative already in 2008 to bring NATO back to territorial and collective defense. There was a modest appetite for that initiative in 2008, I can assure you. But so we should have done much more. So we have huge deficiencies, for example, when it comes to air defense. We have manning shortages in all services, just to make an example. In the new reality in Northern Europe, we also need to prepare for reception of reinforcements to come to Norway and further movement into Sweden and Finland. So I think we also should use our total defense cooperation, perhaps to have a common total defense cooperation in the Nordic region to support that effort. One thing we also need to have in mind is that we should be able to establish a sea control area outside Norway, so that it will be possible to take reinforcements into the area and move them further into Sweden and Finland. That said, I think also together the Nordic states should be able to have a surplus of forces that we could use to support the Baltic states across the Baltic Sea. So that is also a very important element in which we should work together. I think that will be my first statement. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Svein. I originally worked up a scenario with the US Marine Corps and the Royal Marines. It was part of a report for the European Parliament on Arctic security. And the focus was Svalbard and the Spitsbergen Treaty and how it would be manipulated. But what struck me when we were working up this scenario, which I'm willing to share, it's in the public domain, is how big the area of responsibility is. And I looked at the size of the forces involved and the sheer scale of the space which must be engaged. How do you balance that force scaling and the sheer scale of the area of responsibility that is now contested?
It's a huge area. If you add all the maritime zones in which Norway has a responsibility, it is just the same as the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. We have a very good Coast Guard, but it's small. But we also have a system where the Coast Guard is cooperating with the fishing fleet, with all commercial activities at sea, oil and gas business, for example. This is managed through something called the Coast Guard Council, so that we have a report from all of society, if you like, back to our military leadership. Mm. And that is a very good system that helps quite a bit. We do see a buildup of Russian forces in Franz Josef's land,
Yeah.
this big new airstrip there. And we must expect more deployments in that area towards also North America. And that is why also Northcom is interested in this business. The Spitsbergen Treaty is very delicate, many aspects to that.
Yeah.
We could have a separate seminar on it. I'm not too concerned. Of course, Russia wants kind of a common ruling of that island. We have always rejected that. But United States, Britain, China, all signatory countries have the same rights in that area as Russia has. The most delicate issue has to do with the economic zone, or what we call the fishery protection zone around the island. I believe also we have a good case there, because it will be Norway who makes the rules, whatever the outcome would be of that conflict.
Thank you. Anna, 1943, my grandfather took part in the Battle of North Cape, where he sank the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst. Even today, the Royal Navy is contesting that space. But we're stretched. Given that Norwegian defence, Nordic defence, will also need, for example, a working joint expeditionary force, how do you see the Nordic effort plugging into, say, my own country's efforts? Because we're having to make tough choices about which capabilities to send where. Anna.
Yes, of course you ask an exceptionally difficult question, and I'm the second one slightly unprepared for this, even though I had some more time to prepare than Svein had. I think that if you have a look quickly at the Defense Commission and also the Chief of Defense military advice, we are very much aware of the fact that the area up north is challenging. And it's described in detail, and we have one that worked in the Commission for a long time here. And I think that's one of the main conclusions coming out of the Defense Commission, that we need to really strengthen everything that has to do with our maritime conceptualizing of this area. We really need to do more out at sea. Of course, for the time being, the Norwegian Navy is not that huge, to put it mildly. But there are ideas about how you can expand the Navy without spending exceptional huge amounts of money. There is a need for a new family of vessels, so to speak.
Can I push you on that? Because I'm curious about the assumptions in Stockholm, in Helsinki, and in Oslo about what the Americans and the British in particular, what role we can play in your security, and whether we think we can. For example, if there's going to be a kind of reforger revisit where we're bringing in forces from North America, we're going to be having to cover an extremely large North Atlantic space against Northern Fleet submarine attack, Gap, Norwegian Gap as well. This is a big, big operational area. We'll be busy. It might well be the Americans are being pushed elsewhere in the world, because I don't think we'll be given nice single scenarios to deal with. They'll try to make America's life as complicated as they possibly can if Russia and China are in cahoots. Do you, in the various capitals, is there a clear understanding of the limits of American, British and other support for the Nordic defense posture?
Well, I mean, basically you are alluding to, Julian, my intervention yesterday, when I said that transatlantic security is a question of also what's going on in other areas of the world.
Correct.
And what you are alluding to is, of course, the Middle East is resource demanding, and of course the other area that could possibly be extremely resource demanding would be Asia, South China Sea, Taiwan, and also the Koreas. So And also, I mean, it's not that long ago, just 2 or 3 weeks, when they had a report from the Norwegian Foreign Policy Research Institute about the possible lack of allied reinforcements for Norway and for the northern area in case of a simultaneous problem taking place in the Middle East and also in Asia. And I mean, for very long, I mean, and it's not just only the maritime forces. I mean, we would face the same problem also with land forces.
Yeah.
So, of course, that's a quite unpopular question to discuss, because the obvious answer to that question is more for defense purposes. And I noticed that the Admiral said something about the new family of plans for NATO, and also, of course, we have a northern regional plan. And it's one thing having a plan. I mean, a plan is paper or a digital document or whatever you like to call it. But, I mean, it has to be filled up with forces and command structures and everything. And the Admiral alluded to that and said it's quite challenging. And obviously it is. And I would expect that alone to reach the force goals for the plans would require a lot more than 2% of GDP for all countries.
So if I could push you on this, then with Sweden and Finland joining our alliance, is the net gain for the ends, ways and means of alliance defence and deterrence a positive or a negative? Are you a burden for the moment on the rest of the alliance as the Nordic region, or do you bring an added value to the alliance?
I no doubt about that. I mean, obviously it brings an added value to the alliance, but of course it's some more space to fill up on it. The fact is that we have got a much longer border between Russia and NATO, and obviously that's something that has to be taken into consideration. And I would expect that to be heavily debated in NATO and also be very much looked into when the new family of plans came into being last summer.
Yeah.
Because we need to stop thinking about defending Finnmark alone. I mean, we are talking about defending the area north of the polar circle, the Arctic Circle. And we need to see the defense of that area as a part of NATO's defense of the whole area, and not look upon it as Norway, Sweden and Finland. It all has to merge together. And as Svein alluded to, we have been working on that concept for quite some time.
Yeah.
But still, I mean, we can feel in the discussion about how to defend Finnmark that some people still think we have just one road along the coast up to Finnmark from Troms. But that's obviously not true. I mean, we have great road systems through Sweden and Finland into Finnmark. We have access to railroad systems that can transport forces from the coastline, not only up in Narvik, but also from Trondheim over Meråker and into the Swedish system. And you can also enter into the harbor of Oslo and put things on trains to Sweden up north. So, and of course from Gothenburg. So, I mean, the geostrategic situation is much better. But we need to fill up, hopefully, the very sound and sane plans we have with real forces. And that will require more than 2% of the GDP, that ambition alone.
Do you think the political class here in Oslo understands that?
Well, I mean, one thing is understanding it, but I noticed that the Prime Minister yesterday sent some signals that the 2% of GDP may not be, I mean, it could possibly be reached before 2026. He didn't say that directly, but to me he alluded to the long-term plan. And also yesterday evening in the Oslo Military Society, the Minister of Defense gave some quite strong signals and more ambitious signals about what should be devoted to building up the armed forces. So something is moving in the right direction.
I'm going to ask a question of you all later on about your long-term defence plan here in Oslo, but also a long-term Nordic defence plan, because looking 10, 20 years ahead, let's say we have a Northern Sea Passage that opens up. That's going to fundamentally change the strategic importance of this region. It's going to concentrate a lot of Chinese. China's already declared itself a near-Arctic power, which I find rather bizarre, but there you go. They have an interesting view of geography. My first posting was Hong Kong, so I kind of understand how they think. So I want to get back to that later into the longer-term future, but let me turn to Per-Erik now, because I want to understand more, Per-Erik, how Nordic security has evolved after NATO enlargement. How has there been this convergence over the years? And is this almost a completion of a process? Or is this a transformation in how people, our countries, the Nordic countries, see themselves and their defense?
Okay, thank you. It's very important to understand that, or realize that Finland and Sweden's entry into NATO alliance is, of course, a very dominant topic right now in Nordic security defense. Hopefully the charades that are in place by the Hungary and Turkey will be likely over within a few weeks. The entry of Finland and Sweden into the NATO alliance is currently most significant on the political and strategic level. But it's also not a starting point, but it's the end of a process on the military tactical level that started over 30 years ago. And like Effestad said, that the level of integration between tactical forces is very high already. However, like Effestad also alluded to, that the dominant topic regarding Nordic defense cooperation 15 years ago, right in the aftermath of the financial crisis, was collaboration regarding materiel and procurement. And to put a very long story short, the whole initiative faded and failed utterly. And so if you go back 15 years ago and spoke about, in these seminars or conferences, about Nordic cooperations, it was seen as an arena where the potential was very low. It was a very negative loaded term 15 years ago. However, those people who assessed or came to that conclusion 15 years ago, they missed a very important point, that something started already after the Cold War ended. So the watershed moment came actually in 1994, when Finland and Sweden entered the NATO Partnership for Peace program. Yeah. All of a sudden, the former alliance-free and neutral country, they also became members of the EU in 1995. They started to all of a sudden participate in exercises, not only with Norway and Denmark, but also with the US, with Canada, and also European. Well, one of the first arenas we saw the Finns and the Swedish military forces, first the navies and air forces, was the Bolt-Ops exercise led by the US Navy. Finland started to participate already in 1993. And we also, at the same time, in parallel, we had substantial cooperation between the Nordic countries in international operations, both in the Balkans, in Bosnia and in Kosovo, and later in Afghanistan, and in Mali and elsewhere. So I spoke to the commander of the Norwegian army, Major General Lars Leivik, and he told me that since he was a junior officer in the army, throughout his whole career, he has always been cooperated with the Swedes and Finns, either in international operations or in exercises here at home. And also the Air Force, we started very simple exercises in the late 90s, in the cooperative banners exercise, where the Swedes had to learn how to speak English on the radio when they were flying around, which was a standard NATO. They were used to talking in Swedish. I remember in the Cold War when we listened in sometimes on the Swedish Air Force communications, and when they spoke Swedish, we thought it was very funny. It was very strange. But their progress came rather quickly. In the 2000s, the progression in the Finnish Air Force and Swedish Air Force was very high. And you have to remember that in 2011, the Swedish Air Force participated with Gripen aircraft in the operations above Libya. And that was, of course, due to the Air Force training and Air Force exercises that they participated in, together with Norway, Denmark, and other countries as well. They also started about 20 years ago to participate in both with the armies, navies, and air force units in the annual winter exercises in Norway. First just in northern Norway, but about 10 years ago, Sweden started to open up their area in the north. So all of a sudden, the annual winter exercise in Norway, the cold response and the like, they were conducted in northern Norway and also northern Sweden, which was a revolution at the time for us.
Can I jump in there and ask you a question? From your perspective, if you look at the NATO force model, you look at the family of plans, look at the military strategy, defense requires deployable forces and a high degree of readiness. Given that the Swedish tradition is total defense, the Finnish tradition is, shall we say, a more static defense, are Sweden and Finland ready for NATO membership in terms of the demands on their forces that the alliance will place in terms of deployability, readiness, mobility, etc.?
Oh yeah, especially the Swedish armed forces. If you look back in international operations in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s, they were deployed. Both Army, Air Force. We see the Swedish Navy deploy. Also the enabling forces, which are very important in communications, logistics. They also deploy with them. The Finns less so, but they're coming around. By far. But what's and we'll see this in Nordic response by far. If I remember that the predominant structure of the Finnish army is in the south, but they will participate in the exercise up in the high north in March with their forces, and also something that's a very key event happening this summer in June and July, 8 F-18 fighters from the Finnish Air Force will deploy to Romania to participate in the air policing in the Baltic Sea area for 2 months. And that's the first time the Finnish Air Force has deployed in this manner, also with the supporting elements, of course. The air forces in the Nordic countries are highly integrated. If you look at the letter of intent, from the Air Force commanders that they wrote, and signed on at Ramstein in a NATO AirCom meeting, their ambition is to create an integrated C2 solution also in peacetime, a combined joint air operations center. It will not be a standalone entity. It will be integrated in the NATO structure and also with the Joint Force Command structures in crisis and war. And they will also, their ambition is to also have a cross-border basing solution, because the dispersal, and like Admiral Bauer alluded to, you cannot stay static. You have to move around. That also applies for Air Force units. And so now the dispersal model with the Finns and the Swedes have had all along, but Norway and Denmark have to learn. It's now a very important topic in Nordic cooperation, and that's why we last year had the first ever F-35 deployment to a highway strip in Finland. No F-35 in worldwide has done that before us.
So high-end interoperability, you're confident that, for my mind, interoperability only really matters in a high-end crisis when forces are under great stress.
Yeah.
Are you confident that these forces can plug and play with their NATO counterparts in an Article 5 contingency?
Yes, they will, because the Finnish Army and the Swedish Air Force, they have experience from decades, 3 decades of experience from international operations, but also from NATO and international exercises in Europe. They have the navies and air forces are there, so of course. But I mean, if you look at any other country, if you look at the countries in continental Europe, you find elements that are more static than deployable. so if you came to that conclusion by looking at one of the Nordic countries, that's not uncommon.
That's correct.
Yeah,
that's correct.
So I'm not very pessimistic. I'm very optimistic regarding their if they can be applied and used in a sensible manner, definitely. But however, what's very important for the Norwegian or the Nordic prime minister. There was a meeting in August 22 with all 5 Nordic prime ministers, and they a joint statement regarding military defense. Of course, this was just in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, they also emphasized the importance of total defense to enable military defense, but also challenges that we have in Nordic regions that are not necessarily a military problem. Like the Prime Minister spoke yesterday about protecting the seabed infrastructure, pipelines, but also communication cables. We need to get the civilian companies involved in that, and also civilian agencies to deal with those threats.
Let me pause you there if I can, because I want to come to Kristin on this very subject.
Yeah.
Kristin, how should Norway deal with Russia in the High North, given the scale of vulnerabilities? And I use that question, that word advisedly, because what they're doing on the Frunze embankment is they are systematically analysing all our vulnerabilities, and they will exploit them across the conflict spectrum. What are Norway's critical vulnerabilities, and what are you doing to protect them? Kristin.
Thank you, Julian. I will get to answering your question as I move through my prepared remarks.
I think I'm being told off.
I will get to some aspects of your question anyway. I want to thank the Norwegian Atlantic Committee for the invitation as well, and to specify that the opinions that I express are my own and not those of the Norwegian Armed Forces. As we've all touched on, evidently, the security policy environment also for Norway has fundamentally changed. Our neighbor, Russia, has shifted in their ambition, in their intention, in their willingness to put to use different types of capabilities. We're talking about the Nordic NATO expansion, which will shift Norway's security dramatically. We're talking about a European security dynamic writ large that is shifting, and a new Iron Curtain potentially being erased, with military means being revitalized as a tool for interaction, also in the European continent. And these military capabilities entail nuclear weapons as a capability that is more actively being put to use, including by Russia. This will affect European security for decades and Norwegian security for decades. And as we've touched on, Norway is, some would say, in a particularly perilous situation given our geographic location, given the size and scale of the territory that we are set and need to defend. We have more to defend, as many would argue these days. We're in a more exposed situation, but we also have greater leverage and more resources to put to use if only we choose to do so. And I'll point to 3 consequences of this more dangerous situation that have consequences for Norway. And I know that, Kate, yesterday you emphasized how you were enjoying the interaction in the conference, including the severe disagreement on certain issues. I think on these issues there will be a severe agreement as well, including with the Admiral, with regard to the gravity of the situation we're facing, and with regard to the gravity of the types of conversations we need to have as societies in order to deal with these challenges we're facing. The first consequence I want to point on is this related to what the Admiral raised, that the potential for direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is actually increasing. This is not a thought that we've been accustomed to in the past decades. A NATO Article 5 situation, and the notion that we may actually end up in a situation where one of NATO's member states must be defended with collective efforts in the face of aggression, is still a remote thought, I think, in many NATO countries, and I think that remains the case here in Norway as well. So this is a discussion that we need to have. We need to do more to deliberate and consider the gravity of the situation. It is the responsibility of our national authorities to, in the current context, to think more seriously about how we provide for our security and how or whether we are prepared for situations that may be much more dire than the situations we are currently facing on NATO territory. In Norway, as I said, our situation is particularly vulnerable, which means that we, as all NATO countries, must think in precise terms about what the nature of a potential conflict may look like for us. To Norway, this means reconsidering the intrinsic link between energy security and military security and our role as a key energy supplier to Europe, which has become immediately apparent after several attacks on energy infrastructure, not only in states who are at war, but also in states who thought they were at peace. We need to think more seriously about the vulnerabilities and the resilience of our societies, as an adversary like Russia would be likely to target across the board in a situation of increased tension or in an outright war. We can no longer plan for defending only parts of our territory. An adversary would target what they deem to be critical vulnerabilities with regard to both military and civilian infrastructure, and it would pertain to the entirety of our territories, including our major cities. We talk about how total wars are a thing of the past, and indeed, we may thankfully say that they are, but the types of conflict that we could be in for in the near to mid-future, I would say, may be conflicts that will involve much broader swaths of our societies than we have traditionally been thinking about in the post-Cold War era. My second point is that this much more perilous and dangerous Europe requires a shift in our discussion about security and defense, including here in Norway. It's a habitual debate in these days which relates to how helping Ukraine in their fight against the full-scale Russian aggression evidently also enhances European security and NATO security. And it remains, of course, extremely important. But I think the situation we're currently in requires not only action to help Ukraine, it also requires national action to enhance our national preparedness, in addition to doing what we can to help Ukraine, which also evidently enhances NATO security. This requires what I would call a tectonic shift in our mindsets. We in Norway, Norwegian policymakers and Norwegian citizens must make tough prioritizations regarding defense policy and defense spending. As we recommended in the Norwegian Defense Commission report that we handed to the Norwegian government last summer, a significant shift will be necessary to close the gap between our current defense capabilities and the environment that we're facing. We also need a significant shift in our willingness to prioritize defense and preparedness. After a long hiatus after the Cold War, where we've become accustomed to not having to prioritize this task in our society, as we have been enjoying an unprecedented period of peace and prosperity in Europe for the entirety of my adult life, for example. But as we observe from a distance, the events that are taking place on the battlefield in Ukraine should remind us that everything we hold dear takes resources to defend. In the Norwegian context, we tend to deliberate that defense spending isn't just another bullet that must compete with all the other budgetary priorities in our annual budgets. But if we do not have basic security, then our roads, our schools, our hospitals will also become less relevant. I'm worried that we have forgotten that basic security is the fundamental investment and the fundamental guarantee that a state provides for its citizens. And without that basic security, everything else may be jeopardized. My third point is that this more dangerous
Can you just wrap up, please, Kristin?
Sorry?
Your 10 minutes is nearly up. Just please wrap up. Thank you.
I'm at my final point now, so that's
good,
perfect.
very good.
We need to rethink Norwegian security policy. Traditionally, we've been talking in Norway about striking a balance between our deep reliance on the alliance and on our allies as a basic provider for security, and on the other hand, the need to preserve stability and predictability in our neighborhood. Evidently, we do not want increased tension in our neighborhood, But the reality of the High North as a closed-off zone from the realities of geopolitics is over. It's a curious thought, really, given the centrality of these areas to the Russian secure second strike capabilities, that this should be a zone of unprecedented stability. So the time for thinking about this area as a distinct region of Europe has come to an end. We need cool and clear heads in Norway to think about wise and novel policy in these trying times. And there are three challenges that I would like for the next panel as well to touch on. First of all, one of the issues you discussed yesterday, a Europe with a reduced American presence. Will we be ready for that? Are we actually prepared to have that discussion about the consequences of that for our security? Second is the consequences of a stronger Europe for Norway. We are loath to take on the discussion about Norwegian collaboration with the European Union in the security and defense policy domain, but this is a necessary discussion, I think, in the current security environment. And the last point evidently being our relationship with Russia, which we have tended to deal with as a separate and distinct issue, but where our balanced approach to our neighbor in the east will not help us if a confrontation between NATO and Russia materializes.
Thank you, Kristin. Wonderful intervention, but I want to challenge you. I want to reverse your thinking in a sense, if I can. You say we have to think about less America. Well, let's turn that around. You're at a North Atlantic Council meeting, heads of state and government, and Donald Trump is there. And rather than saying preparing for less America, what would you say as one of the Nordic representatives when a President Trump says, okay, guys, great to have you in the alliance, Norway's an old member, but what do you do for America? What do you do for American security? What would be your answer to that?
I think our key, American security is intrinsically linked to European countries' security. And the security policy dynamic in the High North pertains both to the relationship between Russia on the one hand and NATO on the other hand, but it also pertains very directly to Russia on the one hand and the United States on the other hand. There is also an extremely important bilateral dynamic and interplay playing out in the Arctic region and in the High North, where also European NATO states play an important role with regard to ensuring also American security. So I think there are several distinct dynamics at play where sort of reinforcing continental Europe with land forces in a Cold War style scenario is not the only way that European NATO members and European states ensure and enhance also American security.
Thank you. I'm going to put this to you gentlemen as well. I do think that we Europeans have got into a mentality in which we simply see ourselves as recipients of American security largesse. That ain't going to fly in America in the future. We're going to have to go to these summits with a plan and demonstrate the cost benefit to the Americans of this alliance into which they invest so much. So again, what is the message that we give? Fine.
Well, I think one of the contributions that we do make is intelligence. Intelligence on Russian strategic capabilities. And it was said yesterday that Norway is the ears and the eyes of NATO in the north. I think Finland is also the ears and the eyes of NATO in the north now. Also Sweden has a very substantial intelligence support which benefits the United States tremendously. And I think one of the concerns still in the United States is the nuclear forces of Russia. And they also experiment with a lot of exotic new nuclear systems, like the nuclear intercontinental torpedo in the north, and others. And of course, to have a local watch on these efforts is important for America. And they tell us all the time how much they appreciate this. So that is one aspect. Another aspect is the fact that Russia is increasingly getting capabilities, long-range capabilities, which can also be directed against the United States and North America. That is why they are building up gradually the early warning system again in North America. And long-range missiles, aircraft, submarines with long-range missiles could also become a threat to the United States. And if these capabilities emerges from the Kola area, that is of essence for the United States as well. Yeah. You alluded to in the future there could be even much more use of the Northern Sea route. Actually, I think in the future it is perhaps more likely more use of the transport route directly across the North Pole, away from the Russian coastline. And this will be of enormous importance also to the United States. Yeah. We saw it already now with the troubles in the Red Sea, that the Russians pulled in a advertisement for the use of the Northern Sea route instead. So they are very keen to exploit this in the future. And if the Chinese, as you alluded to, also engage much more in the High North, that will also be something of great importance for the United States. And I think we in Scandinavia, in the northern areas, can be give very good assistance to the US strategic objectives in that area.
I mean, thank you. I mean, we might even have to change the language of the Treaty of Washington because about the area of competence, the North Atlantic to the Tropic of Capricorn, because now we have the Arctic Sea and it's all indivisible. So I think we're going to have to think much more greatly about the space in which we must engage. We've got about 19 minutes left. I'm going to get to a couple of questions from the audience, then I'll come back and give you all a chance in reverse order to make your closing remarks. Constanza, please.
I wanted to suggest that we stick with this question of what Europe can do for America and come in on the back of what Christine Brusgaard was saying. It seems to me that I found this entire conference completely fascinating, and I'm really grateful to have been invited. But it is missing one really important aspect of this topic, and that is geoeconomics, right? Norway is the possessor of a really rather nice sovereign wealth fund and is a major energy security actor. And you are talking about security as though all of that didn't exist, right? And of course, the reality is that Europe as an economic actor is of significant interest to the United States as an enabler, a purveyor of leverage vis-à-vis authoritarian great powers. And that has been true in the way that we have coordinated to defend Ukraine and constrain Russia through sanctions and export controls. And it will be even more true if we have to constrain the Chinese in some way, right? Economic deterrence. And that indeed, I think you're entirely right, Kristin, begs the relationship of the question of Norway's relationship with the EU. Thank you.
Kristin, do you want to respond to that?
Well, my immediate reaction would be that I guess we didn't talk about it explicitly, but this notion that of the geoeconomic realities of Norway is sort of implicit in the statement that we have much more to defend. We are in a completely different economic situation now than what we have traditionally been. Having said that, we do not have a tradition of transforming that economic leverage into strategic leverage, and in fact there is a tradition for believing that we should not be making use of this economic muscle in that type of way. But evidently this is an ongoing discussion, and there was another commission looking into this precise issue, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, where the commission also raised a number of these issues with regard to how whether or not that's a tenable position to state explicitly that this should not be used as a tool of foreign policy, and yet evidently it is a tool of foreign policy. It is a fact that this constitutes power that can be put to use.
Per? Anna?
I think that's...
What we really want is your money. Let's be blunt about this. Sir?
Thank you very much. My name is Bjørn Olav Knudsen from the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment. One thing which has not been mentioned so far is climate change, which especially will affect the high north. And NATO in 2021 adopted a so-called Climate Change and Security Action Plan, which is of keen interest to us all, I think, because in the first point in the action plan says that climate change is one of the defining challenges of our times. It is a threat multiplier that impacts allied security, both in the Euro-Atlantic area and in the alliance's broader neighborhood. And climate change affects high north to a very high degree. We all know that. And the Defense Commission, which Christian mentioned, has one chapter in it devoted to climate change. So my question is very simple. How does climate change in the future, will it affect NATO defense planning, and how will it affect how Norway is adapting its defense structure to face such a threat which NATO stated in its action plan from 2021? Thank you very much.
Anna, do you want to say that?
I'm not sure if I would like to answer that question, but...
Per will.
Yes, I can pick up. At NUPI, I led a project for 2 years. We studied climate change and security. We looked at two aspects. One was if there will arise any new types of security challenges due to climate change, or if the existing security challenges will be affected by climate change. And we also looked at the roles of the military in this, because disaster relief due to climate change, phenomena like mudslides, flooding, etc. The militaries will, of course, be asked to support the civilian authorities in these disaster relief scenarios. So after studying this in an 11-group nation project group for 2 years, we found out that there's actually little evidence currently that the security dynamics and the challenges will be affected by climate change. However, the disaster relief aspect and the military involvement in dealing with those extreme situations is we see it's already occurring. I live in northern Norway, and last week we had up to 80 knots wind gusting, and we had roofs flying off buildings and barns. We had extreme. We had to close down city centers because of flying debris from windows that broke, and we had boats sinking, and we had very extreme scenario. Even if the people in the northern Norway are quite used to adverse weather, it was quite challenging given those very extreme conditions we saw, and also temperature variations from +5 to -20 in a very short time. So in these scenarios, of course, the military has to step in and do something. But however, that said, it's not certain that in the future that climate change will also affect security challenges. That may occur, but it's to be determined yet.
Anybody else want to comment on that issue? What I'm looking for in particular is a young person to ask a question, i.e. someone who's younger than Leangkollen or NATO. Sir, I'll come to you because I suspect you're not younger than Leangkollen or NATO, so young though you look. Any student with a burning question, any younger person? Oh dear, it kind of explains the problem, doesn't it, really? So if that's the case, if you have a question, sir? Okay, very good. Very good. Oh, Ian, you're young.
Ian Brzezinski of the Atlantic Council. Yesterday, I'm going to ask an arcane question, but yesterday the Prime Minister referred to a decision or impending decision to place your region, the countries represented here, under the command of Atlantic Command in Norfolk, Virginia, rather than under the NATO command Brunsum. And that strikes me as kind of awkward. I can understand perhaps the Atlantic Command in Norfolk, Virginia, which is 3,000 miles away, being responsible for Operation the Atlantic and perhaps the Arctic Ocean. But why would you want your ground force operations, your air force operations, to be commanded by a naval command 3,000 miles away and not by Brunsum, and perhaps also encompassing integrating operations to defend the Baltics?
It's fine.
I've been arguing very strongly for this for 10 years, I think, so I should try to answer. First of all, Brunsum is very busy with everything they have to cope with on the central region, and they are responsible for a very large number of countries. There was a time after the end of the Cold War when we thought that Brunsum was responsible for the defense of Norway, for the planning, and once I visited them, they didn't even have a map of all of Norway, and they were concentrating on logistic support for Afghanistan operation only. And we saw also in the CMX exercises that they were really not up to the task. Today they are much better qualified, I fully admit that. But I think there is also if you look at defense plans, it is very important to have reinforcements coming through the Atlantic into the northwest Europe, and to have a coherence there is always important. During the Cold War, Norway was under Sekør, not Sekland, although it was debatable. But at that time, we would be separated from the rest of Europe, except Portugal then. And that was a political issue in Norway. So we wanted to be amongst the European countries. Today, we have only one strategic operational command. So we are with the European countries, even if the Joint Forces Command, Norfolk, is responsible for that area. Well, when it comes to the land forces, I foresee the need for perhaps a core headquarters somewhere, perhaps also a KOC for air forces, and it will be closely also connected with the defense of the United Kingdom. So I think this is a huge benefit. Another good thing about it is that it relates to the Northcom, because the commander of Joint Forces Norfolk is also the naval component command of Northcom, responsible for the Arctic. So it hangs together. It is very important to have this connection. And I think also it is important to have a commander with two hats, so that if NATO is not responding for some reasons, then it is possible to respond as a coalition of the willing. We do that all the time. We don't talk so much about it in public, but there is a network of groups and linkages throughout the alliance, and this makes it much easier.
Thank you. I'm going to start wrapping up now. Rob, you got a question? Intervention?
It's not a question,
but... clarification from CMC.
I have a mic, I don't know. I want to clarify, it's not a naval commander. It's a joint force commander who is also, he has of course a lot of maritime responsibilities, because Joint Force Command Norfolk will look after 80% of the AOR of the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. So it's huge, and I agree with that. But if you look at the responsibilities of a Joint Force Commander, the actual location of that command is not necessarily, has to be in the region where he looks after. It's not a tactical commander. It's the one that will sort of look at where the forces need to be, given the priorities of the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. So it's not, but it's important to know it is not a naval commander. He has an American naval hat, which is the Second Fleet Commander, but he's the Joint Force Commander in NATO.
Thank you, Rob. I think it will be a good start, by the way. Sorry, there are no more questions I can take. We have to wrap up. To start by ensuring that all NATO maps include northern Norway. Because if you go into NATO HQ, they're cut off halfway up Norway. Right, let's wrap up. We've got 6 minutes, 46 seconds left in reverse order, a minute or so each for your final comments. Kristin, final takeaways. Tell me what I need to know about Nordic security.
As I touched on in my comments, I'm very preoccupied with these debates that I think they are already underway, as this conference evidently also showcases. But I still think we have a way to go, including here in Norway. I can't speak for other European countries. with regard to how we prioritize our preparedness, our security and defense, I wholeheartedly agree with Constanze that this pertains not only to defense policy, this is a whole of society approach, but where we need to think anew and afresh about how we prepare to defend the values that we hold dear, our societies that we hold dear, the way we organize ourselves as we prepare for what I am concerned may be a bumpy couple of decades ahead. It pertains not only to the dynamics in this European continent, it pertains evidently also to dynamics in the Asian Pacific theater and in other areas of the world that will also directly affect, I think, European security.
Thank you,
so I think and hope we will be prepared to do our share and conduct the lift that we need to do in order to be prepared for that.
Thank you very much. Per-Erik, very briefly, please, your takeaways.
Okay, I'll transcend from the strategic level down to the tactical level for once, because sometimes the devil is in the details, because you can write text at the strategic policy level, but to implement those ideas can be difficult. But what we see now, for instance, in the upcoming Nordic response exercise is that one objective was to have a free flow of military forces between Northern Finland, Northern Sweden, Northern Norway, and without any hassle or bureaucracy involved. However, nobody asked the customs people beforehand, and especially the authorities in Brussels, because think about it, if you are transporting units, a British unit from Norway to Finland and Sweden, you cross the EU border. And nobody asked for exceptions or from the EU rules regarding this. So that was a tremendous showstopper. And also we've seen in infrastructure-wise, so if you take away the civilian peacetime bureaucracies, it's very important that if you think about if you fly in forces to an airport, but also if you transport forces to a harbor in Norway to be transferred further into Sweden and Finland, you might have a harbor capable of supporting heavy military equipment. But however, if there's some choke points, if there are some roads, bridges that cannot are not dimensioned for heavy military transport, then you cannot transfer those forces there. So it's very important that the ministries of transport at each country also not only sets peacetime requirements, but also military requirements in their prioritizations and budgets to enable this. I
mean, you know, Heiner Braus, Ben Hodges, and I wrote a report on this a couple of years ago. Went into great detail about these very issues. They are fundamental to military mobility, which is fundamental to credible deterrence and defence. Arne, final remarks.
Well, we have not that much time left. You briefly mentioned the Northern Sea route. I will just, my comment would be that I think it's overhyped. I mean, it takes a little too long to give all the arguments for that, but in general, I think that's overestimated. We also had the discussion about why is the northern part of Europe important to the US, and for sure I agree with you what you said, Svein. I think we can add that the general increasing interest and attention about nuclear weapons in itself will be a good answer. Also, we should remember that there is no START negotiations going on, the new START and all that. And for the time being, Russia has suspended the talks. And for the time being, we are heading for the first time after many, many years that there will be no effective nuclear arms control agreement between the US and Russia in 2027, if it's not renewed. So that for sure will increase the interest of the Arctic, and in particular, of course, seen from a Norwegian perspective. Let me also add that this incompetent policy of Russia waging war in Ukraine has also basically driven Russia out of the Black Sea, and of course it's turned the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake, which means that the Kola peninsula and the regions up north will be even more important for Russia and for its nuclear deterrence and all those things that actually could affect the US. So I don't think we should be afraid here in Norway that we will slide away from the radar screen, for sure we will be pretty much high up.
Thank you, Arne. Svein, 1 minute.
I think that we should really work on establishing a Nordic total defense cooperation, which is much more effective than today. That would reinforce and support military operations, but also take care of many of the societal vulnerabilities that we all have in a modern society. I think I'm very optimistic about the prospects for defense in the northern area when we work together. I think we have many, many good things going for us, but we need American and others' support in some areas, long-range submarines, long-range aircraft, strategic aircraft, but also extended deterrence. I think it is important to maintain the extended deterrence and to give at least the political support to the United States to maintain that, because I do not believe Russia will have the capabilities to build up much conventional forces in our area, given their situation, but they still have a possibility to reinforce and expand their nuclear forces in our area.
Thank you, Svein. I mean, I have to admit now that I have absolutely no doubt that the alliance is greatly strengthened by having Sweden, Finland join us. There's absolutely no question. Let me finish with a very quick anecdote. My dear friend, Admiral Jonas Hagren, who was a Swedish submarine captain, once, quite outrageously, in an exercise, sank a British aircraft carrier called HMS Invincible. And he was rather proud of this, until I pointed out to him that almost every ship the Royal Navy had christened Invincible had been sunk. On that note, I would like to thank Christine. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a great debate, and thank you for the two sporty guys over there. Svein Effestad, former director of the security department in the MOD in Norway. He came this morning and I said, you have to be part of the panel. And I thought, because Vice Admiral Rune Andersen is gone. And Arne Bård Dalhaug, who is a replacement for Ben Hodges, the Lieutenant General. And of course, the two who originally said yes to take part in the panel and showed up. And thank you to Julian. This has been a fascinating discussion. Now it's a coffee break. It's over in Domus Biblioteka. Originally, we wanted to have it outside, but it was minus 12 degrees today, so we walk over to Domus, have a cup of coffee, and please be back here 11:45 for those of you who speak Norwegian, because we will have a political debate, and it will be in the Norwegian language. Give them a big applause again.